called the social ecology. I'm not so sure what social ecology is. You know, I was looking at some of you last night and you were very social, but I'm not sure how much ecology you were. And then all the people that are busy leaving, that's very sad on your part. All right, I'm going to ask, I don't know if Jane's here. I haven't seen Jane. Oh, here we go. There's Jane. Jane is going to lead us with a 5-minute talk. What is your title? Transformative social stuff. Oh, it's Hanley standing in for Jane. Sorry. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. If we can just get the presentation there. So our talk is Change Projects as a strategy for fostering transformative social learning in the context of the Kruger. So that picture is taken by a course that we are doing with various partners in the landscape. Laura Lull on the Keta project. This is part of the Keta project in partnership with WWF, funded by USAID. But a part of, in this change of what we are doing differently is that it's not real-life learning who is presenting the course, but it's real-life learning who is coordinating various learning partners to bring multiple perspectives and skills together to strengthen what we do. So, I hope, which way do I go? That way, great. So a change project is basically centered around 3 core questions or central questions of what is happening, how has this come to be, and how can we transform? So when we look at these questions, just as they are, it's not really different from what we are currently doing. We are always asking these questions. But then what we are proposing is it's not just the questions that we ask, but it's how we ask the questions and how we approach these questions that makes the difference. So we are proposing, or the Change Project is a move away from the more mainstream approach, but it's not necessarily anti the mainstream approach. So what we look at the mainstream approach of education, which is also often very, it presents itself in how organizations and institutions work, is that there is a strong preference historically in top-down approaches, and even though there is recognition and awareness of we need to collaborate and transdisciplinary, those elements of top-down still comes through when we work in participatory ways, that we value people with Western scientific knowledge often more, we give them more space, we give them their contributions more value for the interventions that we're proposing. But when we move away from the mainstream approach to the Change Project approach, it's not that we are anti-Western science or saying that it's not a good approach. It's just saying that it's not the only approach. It's not the only way of making knowledge. It's not the only way of understanding. And it's rather about weaving these different knowledges and knowledge-making traditions together so that we can expand our understanding of complexity and what happens. So then, when we look at what is happening from a Change Project approach, we look at that we value the diverse knowledges, and then it's also things like, which they spoke about, it's not just the inside project that we're looking at, but we need to be cognizant of what happens inside the park, outside the park, what are the different complex conversations that people need to have, and that there's also very valuable social learning that can happen when we bring these different stakeholders together. The rangers have slightly different perspectives of understanding things and putting things forward than the academics in the room. That's this across the board, that these are the things that we need to be cognizant of. Then also when we look at how has things come to be, so when we go through the Change Project approach and we look at the complexity, we really dive into the complexity and embrace tensions, contradictions, to really understand what are these problems that we are seeing. Often when we work in the communities along the fence line, the fence becomes a very heated and emotional topic. But then we hear like, no, it's just the veterinary fence, but that's not the perception from people outside the park. So how do we navigate those conversations? And part of the reason why we want to do that is because we look at the sociology of gaps. And one of the sociology of the gaps is the gaps of knowing, that we don't have enough and brought enough understanding of knowing, bringing scientific knowledge as well as indigenous knowledge, including indigenous sciences together. Then, finally, when we look at how we transform, to move away from the more universal, one-size-fits-all, what we can do here, we can apply in any Savanna context, to say no, though there is a lot of things that we can learn from Savannas across the world to other contexts, we need to be careful that we need to integrate that for the specific context. Thank you.
How to apply social ecology and stalk you like a leopard to chase you off there. All right, we're gonna have a next discussion. We haven't got time for question by Jacqueline. And we've heard this morning about how important it is to communicate lots of different concepts. And we're going to listen a little bit about communication capacity and options in the region. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair, and thank you everyone for being here. My name is Jacqueline Cochran. I'm a communications consultant. I work with WWF Keta, UNDP, the World Bank, and others. And I've been working in this particular space for about the past 5 years or so. So by far, the vast majority of my work experience comes from other landscapes and other sectors. And I remember very clearly that when I first started working in this particular landscape, I felt very much like an outsider looking in, both thematically and geographically. And I had quite a tough time trying to make sense of what I was seeing, both in terms of the actors and the activities around me. And what I thought initially was a limitation to my work and a detriment, I realized after a while was actually an advantage, because I was able to see the actors and activities in this landscape in a way that they were not necessarily able to see themselves. And with that, I was able to help identify certain blind spots and identify what the cost of these blind spots are, and also what we can do about them and begin to mitigate those blind spots. So that's really what I hope to share with you today. In addition to the findings of the work I've been doing with Laura at WWF Keta and some of the results of the surveys that we've done, I also hope to just share my perspective as an outsider mostly on some of these issues. So a quick overview of what I will talk to you about. Firstly, I'll look at what I call the proximity paradox. We'll go into that. And then a lot of that will not be unfamiliar to the people in this room, but I hope to share with you why this is such an important communications issue. And thirdly, a question that we often forget to ask is, why does it matter, right? And then lastly, we'll be looking at what we can be doing about it. So if we think about protected areas and protecting areas and the animal populations within them, something that is quite clear is that there are both positive and negative impacts associated with those activities. And I'd like to break that down a little bit. So when we look at positive impacts, and bearing in mind that these impacts are both on people and on the planet, if we can simplify it in that way, and they are both tangible and intangible. So let's start with the positive impacts. If we look at protected areas, there are things like how people can generate revenues through tourism, recreational pursuits. Trophy hunting came up a lot earlier today. Other ways that the wildlife economy can generate revenues. These are all some of the positive impacts that we see. There are also intangible positive values and impacts to be derived, which include things like spiritual values that people connect with nature, things like creative pursuits as well. And then we can consider negative impacts. And around that, we heard a lot about things like some of the criminality now from rangers happening in this area. but also things like human-wildlife conflict, ways in which people's lives and livelihoods are directly affected by protected areas. And an immense negative impact that is often also overlooked is the way that protecting areas comes at an opportunity cost as well. What we see is that when we protect an area, that means we can't be using the area for something else. So things like extractive activities, other agricultural pursuits, livestock rearing, farming, that sort of thing. And an element to that I believe is often overlooked is the fact that protected areas in themselves are often in remote areas, often like in this landscape and other transfrontier conservation areas along national borders. National borders, from an organized crime point of view, are inherently more susceptible to criminality. And the very remoteness of these areas make them inherently more likely to be less developed, to suffer from historic and systemic development deficits, governance deficits, socioeconomic deficits. So very much what we see is that in these areas, the need for development is actually often more pronounced, and that land use competition actually comes at a much higher cost. When we start thinking about these negative and positive impacts and how they are to be had, I want to have us think about who gets to experience those. And a very clear picture remains or emerges when we think about external actors versus local actors. When we think about external actors, and by those people I mean really people who do not live and work in this landscape, typically these are people who come and visit the area, come and have an immensely enjoyable experience and get to leave again. And typically what you see from this group of actors is that they experience significant positive impacts from protected areas. The negative impacts that external actors experience are highly limited, very few if any. Another layer to that is the very fact that these external actors can come and spend time in these landscapes inherently means that they are more likely to be more affluent. These are people who can afford to travel, to come and to leave again. And that also means that these people, these actors, are far more likely to have the education, the skills and the resources to advocate for their needs, for their priorities and for their interests. Why is that relevant? Because people who come into these landscapes externally don't just leave and forget about what they experienced here. Often the positive impacts that they experience are so extreme that they feel a sense of ownership. And they exercise that sense of ownership in how they create and disseminate narratives about what happens in an area where they don't live. By contrast, let's look at local actors. People, and by that I mean, we had an immensely vivid picture that the rangers painted for us just now, and beautiful imagery that really clearly demonstrated this. So I'm referring here really to the people who live and work and reside and are around these protected areas. And typically, on average, these populations are far less likely to derive any positive experiences linked to protected areas and protecting areas. On average, people are not likely to be benefiting from economic values associated with a protected area. But on the other hand, these are the actors who are far, far more likely to experience negative impacts associated with protected areas. We spoke about the land use competition, things like human-wildlife conflict. Again, these are things that affect people's lives and livelihoods in a direct way every single day. I think something that we also tend to forget is that food security and financial security are often wrapped up in the same thing for people who live in this area. So when an elephant destroys your crops, that's not just your sort of financial well-being affected, it's your food security too, and it affects your life in a very, very real way. At the same time, if we look at the socioeconomic factor here, people on average who live in these areas where we have these historic underdevelopment aspects are far less likely to have proper employment prospects. They are far less likely to have the education, the skills, and the resources to advocate for their needs, their priorities, and their interests. So ultimately, what we're looking at is a really quite obscene thing, what I call the proximity paradox, where the closer you live to a protected area, the less likely you are to derive positive impacts, the more likely you are to derive extreme negative impacts, and the less likely you are to be able to voice this situation. So a lot of this won't come as news to any of you, but what you might not have considered thoroughly before is, why is this a communications issue? And I'm sure most of you are familiar with this saying, the squeaky wheel gets the grease. So the squeaky wheel in this context are people, right, who exert influence in some way. And the grease in this context are things like attention that get shone onto matters, things like money, resources, programs, and not only just programming, but how effective those programs are, because it is whoever gets to control the narrative and whoever gets to shape what the priorities are who eventually becomes the squeakiest wheel. And typically where we see this in a very pronounced way is around highly emotive and contentious issues. So things, again, like sustainable use, trade, trophy hunting, and that sort of thing, where external actors who don't live in the landscape often have a disproportionate say in the matter. So you might ask, why does this matter? And there are several answers to this question. The first is that there is a huge discrepancy out there between the lived realities and experiences of things and the way that things actually are. And this has a tremendous impact on how decision makers make their decisions. Biodiversity loss, climate change, all these interlinked challenges are urgent issues. We cannot afford to waste time in missing opportunities to have proper interventions that can have sustainable and successful outcomes. And this complete gap in the interests, needs, and experiences of local actors emerging into the landscape means tremendous opportunity losses for how we can intervene more successfully. We also have this compounded echo chamber effect being produced by the increasing use of artificial intelligence, but that is also an opportunity for local actors to utilize. And lastly, I want to really underline how this has a tremendously detrimental effect to the overall outcomes of our conservation efforts. What can we do about it? So I want to acknowledge very clearly that not all local actors are the same, of course. There are actors in the landscape who are far better resourced, who work in this landscape, who are experienced in this landscape, who really do have a seat at the table, and they're not using the voice that they have to advocate better for what the experiences are on the ground. Those actors, I would say, really my big call to action would be, we need a shift in priorities. A lot of the time I hear people complaining about how issues are perceived or portrayed in the media, and to those people I would like to say, make the media your friend, exercise your voice, because it does matter, and the issues that we are facing have an urgency to them. And then we look at local actors who are at a stage where they are lesser resourced. And those local actors really, and I'm talking here about communities who live around these protected areas, these actors really need to be supported. The youth particularly, they need to be given the skills not only to advocate in a persuasive, accurate, strategic and intentional way for their own priorities, but also very clearly to make sense of how what happens here gets communicated out there and how that comes back to affect them. A lot of the interventions that I see in this landscape focused on training don't recognize this aspect of communications training. We see things like leadership training, all sorts of things, but I really want to encourage people to very explicitly think about how they can incorporate communications training. Things like local languages, this came up in a lot of our surveys with actors the need to communicate things in local languages by local communities for local communities is tremendous. Another thing is there doesn't need to be this us versus them polarized thing of local actors versus external actors. Local actors can collaborate and should collaborate more proactively with external actors to leverage their resources and see how we can get a better communications message out there. So I thank you for your time, and I also thank you for communicating more proactively wherever you are. Thank you.
Thank you, Jackie. We've got time for one question or comment or ideas. Or are you guys getting very hungry? Jackie, you've convinced them. It seems like they don't want to ask you anything. All right, we've gone to do the last 5-minute presentation for this. Oh, sorry, Lara, you want to ask something? Oh, we've got the last one as a converted Bakalisa.
Thank you. I'm just stepping in for my colleague, Bakulise Jojo. Unfortunately for WWF, but luckily for another organization who's moved on. But I think it's just me and then lunch, so I'm going to try and stretch this out as much as possible. So I'm presenting a little bit on some of the work that WWF's been doing together with the Kruger to Canyons Biosphere Region, K2C, as well as the Vembe Biosphere Reserve. And this is our application of a methodology that WWF developed in Bhutan around human-wildlife conflict. It's called the Safe Systems Methodology. So you've heard a lot about human-wildlife conflict. It's a growing concern, of course, around the greater Kruger area, and I'm not going to focus a lot on that. But essentially what Safe Systems tries to do is to create spaces where we have safer people, safer assets, safer habitat, and safer wildlife. And it considers these 3 pillars, basically. And what the Safe Systems, what we do with this methodology is we bring, like Jackie says, the squeaky wheels into a room. So it mainly consists of people that are affected by human-wildlife conflict. So it's your community members, your crop farmers, your livestock farmers, concerned citizens that have kids walking to school. And we bring, provincial authorities. Those are also mandated to deal with human-wildlife conflict. And we bring them all together into a workshop, and they run through the whole Safe Systems methodology, answers questions around these 6 themes, policy and legislation, really dig into understanding the conflict and why it's happening, looking at prevention, mitigations, the responses, and also the monitoring of human-wildlife conflict. So the strength of the Safe Systems approach is that it tries to also understand the drivers of human-wildlife conflict, and then as a collective come up with some of the potential solutions to address human-wildlife conflict in a very specific site. So we ran these workshops together with VBR and K2C in Bende Mutale, in Matiani, in Paluabeni, in Finale, and in Welverdiend. And through the process, we identified which were some of the greatest concerns that they had. So in the north, it was really around elephants and hippos and baboons and hyenas and lions, but also issues around cattle entering into the park. In Paluabeni, they've got major issues around elephants. In Finale, it was also around crocodiles and hippos, also lions and cattle going into the park. And then around Welverdiend area, it was also around predation and then also crop raiding by elephants. So we had workshops with all the different stakeholders in all of those in those communities. And I just quickly wanted to share with you some of the interventions that they've come up with. So again, this is a bottom-up approach. This is what people want. And you'll see there are quite a few things around livelihoods development. And you'll ask, how does livelihood development really link to human-wildlife conflict management? But I mean, we can't talk to communities about conservation issues if we don't also consider their socioeconomic challenges and things that they need to improve their livelihoods. So there in Bende Mutale, They ask for some environmental education and awareness around human-wildlife conflict management and how to behave around, dangerous game for their communities. They really want to do some agro-processing around the marula and baobab that's available there. Of course, some tourism activities, agriculture, growing veggies and chilies. Chilies also, I'm sure most of you know, also one of those methods that people use to also deter elephants. And they also want access to market in terms of the Kruger National Park. And they also want to have a development center for their youth. In Mationi, they said that they need improved monitoring and reporting through environmental monitors, and we managed to second those environmental monitors there, so that's why it's got a green tick. And they also asked for some livelihood development. They also thought beekeeping would be a nice idea, because again, that's also a human wildlife conflict management method. In Paluabeni, they spoke about the erection of the reserve fence, and they've already started with that in terms of the community getting together to clear the area, to prepare the area for the fence, and now the reserve's going to come and actually help put up that fence. Again, some livelihoods activities there. They also wanted better communication and reports between them and the protected area around human-wildlife conflict and how they can report these things. Cattle grazing plans, and also elephant monitors who've also been appointed through our program. In Finale, they really wanted to talk to the private sector, because they are located close to the private sector, around compensation, grazing camps and cattle reflectors, some skills development, again, more livelihoods development. And then lastly, in Velverdiend, they wanted more fence patrols and repairs. They also wanted, and Ashley, something for you to note, improved law enforcement and perhaps even some restorative justice approaches there. They wanted to engage Sandbox on the compensation process, and we had that workshop with them, and Sandbox came and they explained the whole process to them, which was, I think, a great success. Also, again, better communications for reporting, and they also wanted to do some land use planning. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura, in your new format. That's brought us to the end of this very interesting session and lots of discussions. I hope that it has provided us with a bit of a spectrum outside our usual discussions, which is very biophysically focused. And hopefully you can have a few more discussions with some of the colleagues while you have lunch. I don't think there's any announcements, Judith.